Welcome to our final video in this series, which is on extinction, forming part of Evolution of Organisms, chapter 25, the last of the book. Okay, and as this little cartoon here creates, here's a happy little asteroid or meteorite wanting to come and visit the Earth to see the dinosaurs. Yeah, and we all know how that one turned out. So the concepts here is that we're looking at a few different things that relate to extinction. One is that populations with reduced genetic diversity have a high risk of extinction, human activities and their role, and then the importance of maintaining biodiversity. So we actually have to start off with a bit of a little look back in history across a number of different periods and looking at some of the extinctions that happened across geological time. So we can set up geological time perhaps looking a little bit like this. So this is from the present day back to 650 million years ago, when the first multicellular life was appearing. And the reason that Ediacaran is here is because that's one of those key periods. So if we look at about 650 to 550 million years ago, we've got this Ediacaran period where the first skeletons appear in the fossil record and soft-bodied animals appeared. Before this, we only really had those perhaps microfossils or even smaller of single-celled organisms. The Ediacaran period is actually named after Ediacara, which is part of South Australia. So that's where the best fossils of this type are. So we have a great history and involvement in geological periods in South Australia. Comes up a number of times in this video. And so we're very, very fortunate in the Flinders Ranges. We have these amazing fossils. This one's Dickinsonia, which would have been part of the organisms living on the Ediacaran seabed around this time. So not really organisms closely related to anything we might recognize these days, but certainly some of the first multicellular organisms were happening at this period. They just look like blobs in the rocks, and there's a Professor Flint song you can listen to. Soon after the Ediacaran, we had the Cambrian period, sometimes called the Cambrian explosion, because there was a huge diversification of the species at this time. And this is where we start to see some of the things we might recognize, like the early fishes, and chordates being, vertebrates with a spinal cord. One of the most famous periods, of course, is the Mesozoic era, which includes the Triassic, Jurassic and Cretaceous. Here we have a great example from Australia again of Australovenator, a big carnivore from the late Cretaceous. But clearly T-Rex and Stegosaurus would be prime examples from the Mesozoic era. Went for about 180 million years. And so, for instance, between the first and the end of the dinosaurs was a longer period than between dinosaurs and now. So there's less time between us and Triceratops than there is between Triceratops and some of those early raptors. So we also see the appearance of the first birds and primates at this stage in time. But again, all of these are extinct these days. So coming up to more modern times, just at the end of things here, we have the appearance of humans. So perhaps around 2 million years ago was the first appearance of humans, and we have a number of different extinct human species here. It's important to note that at certain times in history, and perhaps looking at about 600,000 years ago, there were as many as 4 or 5 different human species coexisting on the planet at the same time. Quite extraordinary to think about, 5 different species of humans and how they might have interacted. Even as recently as 60,000 years ago, when the Aboriginal peoples were first arriving in Australia, there would have been 2 or 3 species in existence. So they were Homo sapiens, and are, but at the same time there was Homo floresiensis and Homo neanderthalensis at the same time. And so 3 species of humans existing at the same time. The hobbits of Flores Islands disappeared about 50,000 years ago, and the Neanderthals perhaps about 28,000 years ago, leaving Homo sapiens to dominate all of the planet. And just if you weren't aware, most people would be aware of Neanderthals. The Homo floresiensis is dubbed the Hobbit because they were quite small. Here's the model maker who made this tiny model here of what these one of the last surviving other species of humans other than Homo sapiens would have looked like. So again, quite extraordinary to think about these being around at the same time as the Aboriginal Homo sapiens. This is in Southeast Asia, so perhaps crossing paths, and also the other end of things in Europe would have been Neanderthals and Homo sapiens coexisting as well at different times. And perhaps even though there's a gap here, a bit more overlap than what's represented. So, as I mentioned, most of these species that we're talking about are extinct, and in fact 99% or maybe more than 99% of species that have existed are now extinct. And so what is extinction, and how does it happen? Clearly extinction is around when a population of a species goes towards zero and there are no longer any more of that species. And this happens all the time as what we might call background extinction. One species at a time, its population eventually gets lower and lower due to some sort of ongoing change in the environment, or predation from another species, or just in terms of not being well adapted to their environment. And you either evolve into something else or become extinct, and that goes on all the time. But also throughout history we've had these mass extinctions where not just one species but multiple species or whole families or orders become extinct. And so what we have in terms of the definitions is a few different differences here that you can look through, but normally background extinction is something that's happening over a long time with a lot of processes as a result of evolution, whereas these mass extinctions often relate to catastrophes or sudden climate change. And we'll have a look at some of those. So here on this axis we see the extinctions, so peaks showing when there's lots of extinctions. On this next graph we're actually looking at the number of different families in terms of, kingdom, phylum, order. King Philip cried out for good soup. So kingdom, phylum, order, family, genus, and species. And so the families here are going down after each of these events, and this is where we have these mass extinctions. So basically have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mass extinctions recognized in our geological history. And this tends to change the types of families that are around. So here we see trilobites really dominating those early oceans. And then over here at the Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous period, we have the age of the reptiles and dinosaurs. At the end of the Cretaceous, the mammals tend to be the dominant fauna that we see. And so each of these marks the end of a geological era, but also a change in the biological nature and the dominant species in the environment. But we also see that there's a bit of a steep rise after each event as well, because when these mass extinction occurs, they clear out all of these ecological niches, remove dominant species, and then new forms can evolve quite rapidly. And in fact, we're just going to talk to you about a theory here about an impact that happened again in South Australia, the Ackerman impact, at about this time, that might have also cleared out some things and allowed for the Cambrian explosion to happen and new forms to happen. So again, whenever you can clear out the old stuff through some sort of disaster, new forms will come through. So let's learn a little bit more about the Ackerman impact. Not part of the course as such, but because we are in South Australia, we really should be knowing about this. So here's Adelaide and here's Eyre Peninsula, and we have a large part of this Eyre Peninsula that's actually part of a huge crater. So Lake Ackerman itself is the core of that crater, and you can see that here on the map. But around there are a number of other lakes that show low-lying land that are part of that crater ring. So it's really remarkable to think that we have in our outback here a sign of an impact that happened 600 million years ago and may have caused huge biological changes in not just the Australian environment but in the environment around the world to drive forward evolution. So Victor Gostin here, someone who I know, published this working through the University of Adelaide around how the Ackerman impact event had major environmental consequences. And so this is a review paper looking at some of the findings over the last 25 years after this was discovered in the late 80s, this impact site. So really important discovery in South Australia that has biological implications. So We had 5 extinctions. Well, now we're actually looking at the 6th mass extinction. And while the other ones mostly caused by, as I said, massive climate change and meteor impacts and things like that, volcanic activity is another big cause of that. The most recent mass extinction is caused by human activities. And so what we're seeing at the moment is that the observed number of extinctions in different orders of animals is much higher than what we'd expect over the background. So many times higher, huge numbers of extinctions happening, and we're all fairly aware of that as an issue, that extinctions and threatened species are a problem. So obviously extinction, very hard to come back from, although some technologies are being developed around that. But even with that, we have a number of threatened species like cheetahs, for example, and we think, well, we could save them through captive breeding. But it's not as easy as it looks, because one of the issues is, you can see here, is that genetic diversity drops rapidly with population size. So the gene pool gets much smaller as the population gets smaller. That's what we'd expect. If you breed up from a small population, though, even though your population size might increase, the genetic diversity doesn't increase very rapidly. Because remember, new alleles require useful mutations to accumulate in the population, or at least ones that don't have a damaging effect, and that happens fairly slowly. So you end up with low genetic diversity because you had a low founder population. The real problem with this then is that the population that you do have, even if it's the same size as it was originally, because it's less genetically diverse, it's more vulnerable, because a lot of the members of that population have very similar genetics and therefore are very susceptible to the same kind of thing. So this has an example that all the cubs are going to be susceptible to the same pathogen. So something that might make only 1 out of 3 sick here makes all 3 of them sick here. So all populations that have gone quite small don't have a lot of genetic diversity and therefore are at risk. Other examples might be a small population that ends up on an island, like a founder population. Again, low levels of genetic diversity, high levels of vulnerability. So, what is causing the 6th great mass extinction? Well, when we look at the human contributions, by far the biggest contributor is habitat alteration. Now, listed in the notes below, there's a whole lot of different examples of things that are doing this, but clearly deforestation and clearing of land is a major one. There's also a lot of commercial hunting, and particularly when we look at the fisheries, commercial hunting of fish is much more common than of land species. We also have competition with introduced species, so those 3 are really big. Other ones around here tend to cause some issues as well. And pollution, even though it's only down at 1%, that's direct pollution in terms of animals being poisoned by pollutants. But again, when we look at habitat alteration and change to the climate, pollution is a major contributor to that. So this looks at climate change. It's going to be pretty small to you to see this, but there's a link to the map here that you can go to and look at some of the details of this. But basically what we're saying here is that climate change, temperature, rainfall, water availability, all those sort of things, having huge impacts on the natural environment. Clearly plants and animals and other parts of the ecosystem are going to be affected by this. And, it's going to lead to floods and natural disasters and fires and water shortages and melting of glaciers and ice caps, all that kind of stuff, which will have huge impacts on the local flora and fauna, like I said, and also flow-on effects to humans. Animals experiencing climate change might have the ability to migrate or move somewhere else, especially if they are mobile. Not always so easy, and the areas they go into are already populated. Plants can't really pick up their roots and move, so a lot of plant species that are long-lived don't have a chance of battling climate change. Other ones might seed and find conditions elsewhere, so things that could normally live in some climates might have to move further north or south to find cooler climates or more rainfall. But again, the ability to migrate or adapt to climate change is okay for a bit, but then as climate change accelerates beyond the ability for species to adapt, they're going to lead to major extinctions. So, loss of species is a problem, and for many reasons, but the key ones are around a loss of biodiversity. biodiversity is the range of different populations that exist within an area, and high biodiversity is really important for a number of factors.